All right, we are going to begin, even though we're expecting more people, because we are putting these online, and in case there are people online, when you tell them that the event starts at 2, you should start at 2. So
Yeah.
those of you who are here on time, I'm glad about that, ready on time. That's good. And the people who missed the beginning can always watch the YouTube version. Now, what I'm going to do today is going to be an extension of what we've done the last couple of Saturdays. We had a conference at NASA 2 weeks ago, which included a keynote from Keisha, included a member of the Right Climate Stuff team from former NASA members, Tom Weissmuller, who spoke, and also included Megan Beats from the Basement team. And they laid out a very exciting perspective of what is possible were we in the United States to revive the space program. And this is not a luxury or some abstraction. It's an absolute necessity if we're going to save the country. And Keisha has just written an article, which will be in the next EIR on this theme. That we're not talking about something that's nice ideas or a good kind of thing, but something that's absolutely essential to win back the heart and soul of our nation and break with the pessimism and the quality of defeatism which now characterizes the American people. Now, last week I talked about the question of when we had leaders with vision, and we took up the short but decisive period of John F. Kennedy as president. How in his very brief period of time in the office, he came to realize that you couldn't coexist with the British Empire. Kennedy had a record, and people can go back and look at the presentation if you'd like, but he had a record over years from his time in the Senate as being an opponent of British colonial policy. This was a part of the core of Kennedy's existence, the idea that the United States was founded as an anti-colonial movement, and that the colonial power that existed that we fought against in the 1770s was still a dominant force on the planet after World War II, even though that empire was responsible for 2 wars. Now, how many Americans understand that today? If you go back and read Kennedy's speeches from the 50s when he was in the Senate, and he's talking against the British Empire, against the imperial policies, the underdevelopment, at a time when we were competing with Russia in the Cold War as to which bloc, the so-called free bloc or the Soviet bloc, would be the determining factor in shaping governments of Africa. And Kennedy realized we were losing governments because of our policies, that we were following the British imperial policies. And so he had a very clear break with that. But his break was not that he got up and gave a speech denouncing Winston Churchill or attacking the British Empire, but systematically he was changing the policies of the United States in key areas, on economic policy primarily, on policy relations with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, the movement toward agreement in these areas on certain key issues, and what was one of them? Space. Kennedy proposed 2 months before he was killed, a little less than 2 months before he was killed, at the United Nations, that Russia and the United States should engage in a joint mission to the moon. Now, his assassination led to a complete transformation of our country. And what I'm going to talk about today is how this Kennedy vision should be updated and upgraded to become the policy of the United States today, because that vision is now the vision of the Chinese and the Russians. Ironically, the people who we were opposed to in the Cold War, you're talking about winning the Cold War? We didn't win it because we had more nuclear missiles. We won the Cold War because the opponents, our opponents, adopted the American system outlook, while we threw it out the window and became a prototype of a British-directed empire, especially under the last 2 presidents, Bush and Obama. Now, what Keisha in particular has been presenting in her work recently, which is bringing it up to date from what she had done in her 3 campaigns, 2 of which were successful in terms of winning the Democratic nomination. I would say the 3rd one was successful in terms of shaping the whole election in 2014 nationally. But what she's been emphasizing, and what Lyndon LaRouche has been emphasizing, is space is not about engineering or technology or clever ideas of the sort of how to move something outside of our atmosphere. All that's necessary, but the question of space is a vision of what man really is and man's relationship to the universe. And the universe is not just our atmosphere and our planet, but far beyond it, because as we now know, what we have on Earth is shaped by events that have taken place over billions of years in the universe as a whole. And we know very little about it. We see some of the effects. We're starting to get ideas about radiation, cosmic radiation, how the Earth was formed. We're beginning to get better ideas about how the Earth was formed by what we're seeing from looking at the moon, looking at Mars, from some of the missions we're sending into deep space. But all of that tells us something that we tend to overlook, which is what is the nature of man. And this is the essence of what we have to do, our organization, our tiny, poor organization. We're tiny and poor when it comes to numbers and money, but we're the richest organization on the planet when it comes to the most valuable resource that's missing, which is ideas. And not just ideas, but how do you generate new ideas? Creativity. Breaking with the British imperial system, which says you can only know things from an Aristotelian standpoint. What you see, what bounces off you, what you bounce off, what you rub up against, what makes you feel good when you rub up against it. You know, this idea of the empiricism, the empirical worldview, that we can only know relationships among objects, and we only know them in terms of what we see. And if you don't see it, you don't know it. Now, Lynn has been making the point for a number of years, and there was a very beautiful discussion of this from Jason Ross last night. What was the method of Einstein? This method of thought objects, this method of using the imagination to see with your mind what you can't see either with your eyes or with instruments. With instruments, you can begin to test your hypotheses, but we're far behind the instruments or the instrumentation. What was going on in Einstein's mind? And yet in schools, what are we taught? Einstein's theories are unproven. We don't really know what who took a principle of geometry, and not geometry in terms of the axioms and postulates, but of the higher geometry. You know, what is it? What are the forces that we don't see that shape the relationships of objects in the universe? And Brunelleschi came up with the concept. I don't think he invented it, but he used it, the catenary principle, to figure out how to build a dome. So it's this kind of creative thinking where we can study people who have done it in the past, who have come up with these ideas in the past. But then we have to inspire a new generation to make the new discoveries of the future. And we had an interesting discussion a couple of days ago about who was it who was involved in the moon project. You had a lot of engineers. The average age of the engineers in the moon project, the Apollo project, was in their mid to late 20s. Young people who dedicated everything to that. The managers were in their mid to late 30s. The astronauts were all, from when they first started, late 20s to the early 40s by the time some of them got into space. But what was moving these young people? Well, one, it was a youthful president who had a vision and defined a mission. But it was also older scientists, people like Wernher von Braun, people in particular like Croft Erica, who put forward a vision. Now, what we have to do today is take our poor, sad sack fellow Americans who are subjecting themselves to one of the worst forms of sadomasochistic practice, namely watching the presidential campaign. You know, it's like watching someone vomit in slow motion, 16 hours a day. You turn on CNN any time of day or night, and they have some so-called expert who doesn't know a damn thing. Maybe they interviewed one person. Maybe they read a book sometime, talking about Trump and Kasich and Hillary, and as though they actually know something. And the pundits are wrong most of the time because they don't know what's going on with the population. The population is not watching this thing so closely. They're just angry, and they're choosing their candidates as to who expresses their anger the best. And instead of seeing that there's legitimate reason for anger, you know, the so-called white working class, what are they angry about? Are they really all racists, as the media would have you believe? For most of them, you know, when Trump says something that's stupid, it rolls off their back. What they're picking up is when Trump says you're being screwed by Wall Street, or when Bernie says you're being screwed by Wall Street, or trade deals, or bailouts. That's what people are mad about. But what in the United States is being put forward as an alternative? Hillary? Here's Hillary, whose campaign is, I'm the follow-up to Obama. We saw something really amazing the last couple of days. Obama did a long interview with an Obama bot, you know, a guy who, whatever Obama says, this guy loves. And Obama gave a report on how proud he was that he didn't bomb Syria after the alleged use by Syria of chemical weapons. Well, the fact of the matter is that it's been proven that it was the Syrian rebels who had the chemical weapons, not Assad's government. So Obama could say, I'm proud I didn't do it because it would have been done for the wrong reason. No, he still says Assad did it. But he made the right decision not to bomb. Now, how did he make that decision? The Joint Chiefs of Staff told him that if you do this, you're going to have to deal with consequences we're not prepared for. And one of those consequences was an angry electorate, which came out and said, we don't want to go to war in Syria. Did Obama say that? No, because he's a liar. He's a puppet for the interests that want war, and he lies about his motivations. Then on Libya, what did he say about Libya? We did the right thing in Libya. It was the Europeans who didn't follow through. Now, the Europeans probably wouldn't have done what they did in Libya had we not promised to back them up. And back them up we did, illegally. We sent bombers in there. We had some troops in there. Did we declare war? No. Had Libya attacked us? Not in the last 40 years. It's even questionable whether they did before that. So what was the basis of the war? It was a lie. What was the lie? Gaddafi's going to attack his own people. Well, in fact, Gaddafi was going after Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That's who we moved in to protect. And that's what caused the catastrophe, which then spread into Syria. The arms that we gave the terrorists in Libya were shipped through Turkey, our great ally, to Syria to be used to slaughter the Syrian people. So Obama lied like crazy on this. Maybe he did to protect Hillary, maybe he did to protect his own so-called legacy. But that's what we want from a president. And then here's poor old Bernie Sanders. The guy's got a good script on Wall Street. Partly it was taken from us. The need for Glass-Steagall, the need to separate the banks. So what he says on those things are not bad. They don't go far enough. What he says on getting rid of private insurance, that's fine. But then after talking about how terrible the situation has been for the American people, that we haven't had wage increases for 16 years, we've had bailouts, we've had cuts in living standards. Then he says, thank God for Barack Obama, because it could have been worse. Well, Obama continued the policies of Bush. So Bernie disqualifies himself with those kinds of statements. I'm not going to go through the presidential campaign. I just want to point out that what we're seeing from Obama and from Hillary is a bunch of lies. But I'll say one thing about the Republican side. They are co-conspirators with Obama and Hillary. Because when there were some Democrats who tried to use the Constitution to stop the war in Libya, the Republicans backed Obama because they wanted the war. When there was an attempt to get into the clear, who's funding the terrorists, the role of the Saudis? The Republicans protected Bush, who classified the evidence of the Saudi role, which Obama then continued to classify to cover up the Saudi role. So both of these parties have been involved. So where do you look for an alternative in the United States? Well, what Lyndon LaRouche has emphasized is we have to look outside of the United States. We have to look at what Putin is doing, and we have to look at what the Chinese are doing. Now, what is it that they're doing? Well, they rejected the transatlantic financial system, which is the imperial system. I'm not going to go through the details because we have this. For those of you who don't do this already, you should go to LaRouchePat.com. And where it says activities, you scroll down and you can find where you can get free every single day something called our daily lead, which will give you on a daily basis some background on what's happening. And then if you want to go further, it's a very easy process. You can get the EIR Daily Alert, which is $100 a month or $1,200 a year, which gives you more details on what's happening. So I'm not going to go through what's available on the website, except to say that the European banks are collapsing, and the proof of it is that the European Central Bank, under Goldman Sachs alumni Mario Draghi, just adopted policies that are certifiably insane. More quantitative easing. But they don't have bonds to buy, so what are they buying? They're buying bank bonds. They're buying corporate bonds. How is a central bank reduced to buying corporate bonds? Well, they've got to put money in circulation. What's the argument? If money's in circulation, people will start buying more. Well, people aren't buying more because they're not making money. They don't have the income. They're also terrified that the banks are going to collapse and that they get no money from their savings accounts. The Germans are great savers. And the idea in Germany used to be you put money in a bank or in a bond or something like that, and you save it and it builds up over time. What happens when there's negative interest rates? You end up paying the bank to leave your money in the bank. And under the new EU resolution, single resolution mechanism, they can take your money if they need to. So how is it going to help to go with negative lending and negative interest? You know what negative lending is? No. A bank borrows money and pays back less than they borrow. Now, why can't we get in on that?
Right.
Shouldn't that have happened with the mortgage problem?
Because you're not a criminal.
Well, that's right. The criminals get negative lending. So what does this show? I mean, is this going to work? Of course not. It shows how desperate they are. So the European financial system is bankrupt. But worse than that, the Europeans went along with the British and Obama on targeting Russia with sanctions. Who's paying the price? Well, it's hurting the Russians, but it's hurting the Europeans more because Russia was one of their markets. And there's a protest to that. Now, what else is happening? Our support of terrorism in the Middle East was aimed at doing what? Was it just that we didn't like Saddam, we don't like Assad? What is it we don't like about them? They don't go along with the transatlantic financial system. They're looking for an alternative. And where are they looking? They're looking to Eurasia, to Russia, to China. And so they're being attacked by terrorists, but the ultimate goal, it's not Syria, it was not Libya. As Lyndon LaRouche pointed out when the Libyan operation started, you remember what he said? He said, this is targeting Putin and Russia. And that's the truth. Russia is under a coordinated assault from the Ukraine to the Syrian operations, to the oil price wars, to the attack on the ruble, and blaming Putin for everything. Some guy drops dead in anywhere, and it's Putin who did it. So this is the line that's coming out, and both parties have the line. Now, what's the point here? The first point is the transatlantic system is dead. But what China has done, and China has been doing this for years, they've started it to carry out a program to lift up their population out of poverty. And they took as their approach, the approach which was the approach of Lyndon and LaRouche going back to 1990-91, when communism collapsed. Now we proclaim, George Bush Sr. proclaimed victory, as though he had something to do with the collapse of communism in Europe. You know, the argument that the Reagan supporters and Bush claim is that we won the Cold War because of American free enterprise. Now, it's a longer story than that, but that's a complete lie. What happened is the Soviet system was a victim of its own incompetence and incapacities, but its inability to sustain a consumer economy and at the same time a war buildup. And it did collapse. And the question was, what should our victory dance should have been? What should we have done then? There was a big victory dance, but there was fear. What happens when Germany unifies? Does Germany become the leading power in Europe? And if so, does Germany turn toward Poland and Russia and China? How do we stop that? That was the policy of Mitterrand and Thatcher and Bush. And what did they do? They set up the euro. They set up the euro in a way that couldn't succeed, the European Union in a way that couldn't succeed, and saddled Germany with the responsibility to bail out countries that fell by the wayside, like Greece, like Spain, like Portugal, like Italy. And at a certain point, the Germans couldn't take it anymore. Now you add to that the crisis in Ukraine, which we caused by supporting an overthrow of an elected government. Add to that the war in the Middle East. And what happened? We had a refugee crisis. Millions of people suddenly driven from their homes in Syria, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. And all of a sudden the Turks opened the gates and let them come into Europe. So you add the refugee crisis to the economic crisis, to the strategic crisis, and Europe is paralyzed. The EU may collapse at some point in the near future. As far as this country is concerned, the same president who's bragging about his brilliant foreign policy victories tells us that we're the best economy ever. Because unemployment is, the mythical unemployment is at below 5%. Does that mean only 5% of the people who want jobs are unemployed? No, we've got 90-something million people who could be in the workforce who are not. Now, some of them are injured. Some of them have problems with various kinds of disabilities. Many of them are older. Many of them are younger who never looked for jobs because it was a hopeless undertaking. That's a great economy. The people who are working 2 or 3 jobs trying to pay a very high rent that they can't afford. Or they don't have rent because they're paying off student loans and they move in with their mothers and fathers. The reality is that the US physical economy has been targeted and attacked since the decision to take down NASA in the late 60s, early 70s. And this was given a big impetus to attack it further when Obama came into office and basically said he's going to phase out NASA. Now, it's not that NASA is a huge part of US manufacturing, but it's a front end. It's an area of innovation that was felt throughout the whole economy. And so here we are with the US economy in a state of free fall in terms of physical economy. The European economy is collapsing. And what do we say? We say, well, China's slowing down. That's the big problem with the world economy. China didn't hit 7% growth this year. Where is US growth right now? Does anyone know?
1.
It's almost 0 the last 2 quarters. Does anyone think that might be a problem for the world economy, especially when you have a president who goes around the world saying we're the engine for the world economy? This is an engine that went off the cliff. We're bringing the world economy down with us, except for countries that aren't prepared to go with us. Now, let me just go through a couple aspects of the Eurasian approach. And we do have, I don't have it here, we can get it, and someone can get a copy for me to show you. A report called the Eurasian Land Route, this New Silk Road. This is a special report that we produced. This goes beyond the Chinese in a way. Chinese are doing very good things. What we do in this is we show how and why this will work, why this is the right approach to reviving a world economy, not reviving it so that it's static to what it was before, but a totally new approach. The New Silk Road becomes the world language. This is the report that's now out in Arabic, in Chinese, and soon it's going to be out in Korean. It's been out in English. Have you read it? Those of you who read English, get a copy and read it. This is 300 and something pages with page after page of projects, charts, maps, discussion of what is real economic value. And Mrs. LaRouche, who's the impetus behind this, is just appeared at an event in India, which included many top government and former government officials, to discuss the Indian role in this. She's been in China at the key conferences. We've held conferences all over the world on this. And the Chinese recognize that this is what their policy should be. Xi Jinping in 2013 said, this is the Chinese policy. We've been saying since 1991-92, this is what they should do. Now, just give you a couple figures. There are several institutions that the Chinese have set up in collaboration with other countries. One is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is to build infrastructure in South Asia. Another is the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank. There's a Silk Road Fund. There's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization Fund. These are funding not just high-speed rail, transportation, but corridors between the location, the hubs. Corridors which include water management projects, include power, include integrated communication, transport, and energy grids, so that you can build new cities along these corridors, the same way a city of Denver became a big city. The idea that Lincoln had to move from Chicago and St. Louis west to build up a whole portion of what was basically empty land. We never completed the job. And we don't have a single mile of high-speed rail in the United States. The Chinese have built somewhere between 10 and 20,000 miles of high-speed rail. The Chinese. And they're talking about another 30,000 miles. They're building high-speed rail through Tajikistan, through Nepal. There are plans to go through India and through Iran, link up Baghdad and Aqaba, finish what was never done, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad is a high-speed rail. These are the connection points that will lift the whole world economy. That's what the Chinese are doing. That's what the Eurasian perspective is. Now, I'll just give you some figures on this. The Chinese already have on the books $600 billion of investments planned. That's not money dispersed yet, but $600 billion that they're putting into these projects. These include projects in 49 countries. Actually, they've already invested in projects in 49 countries. The 600 billion is in 60 countries. But already they've invested in 49 countries, 3,987 projects. These are not projects like modernizing a bridge. These are the most challenging bridge architectural projects in the world. And there's already 14.8 billion that's put into these things. But think what another 600 billion would mean, and $1 trillion. The Chinese are still sitting on close to $4 trillion in dollar reserves. So they can afford it. Now we're talking about China militarization. You know, China spends about 5% what we spend on defense? Did you know that?
No.
We're talking about China's going to take over all of South Asia. They're putting ships in the water. Well, they have a navy. They do want to protect their ships. Who are they protecting them from? Obama. Hillary Clinton. Ted Cruz. Marco Rubio. Little Marco. You know, the big guy who gets up there and says, we need the strongest military in the world. We had the strongest military in the world, and we lost Iraq. We're losing Syria. We can't win a war in Afghanistan because we're fighting the wrong wars. These are imperial wars that will never develop a nation. The Chinese are going into Afghanistan now. The Chinese may revive something that Assad had as a plan in 2004. You know, Assad had a plan called the 5 Seas Initiative. It was to connect the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. To connect them through rail and these economic development projects. Why couldn't he do it? Because we declared him an outlaw and said his regime has to be brought down. That's what Obama did. Now, the Chinese are going in there. Recently, Xi Jinping went to Tehran. The Iranians want development. They're organizing for this. He went to Egypt. The Egyptians want development. They're already conducting projects, building projects that are now moving into industrial and agricultural phases. And by the way, next Saturday, we'll have an official from the Egyptian government speaking at our meeting here, going through what Egypt is doing. So bring people with you next week. Where else do they go? They went to Riyadh, to Saudi Arabia. Now, why would Xi Jinping go into Saudi Arabia? Well, the Saudis are having a financial problem. They're having a military problem. With all the aid and advanced technology, military technology they're getting from the United States and the British, they can't beat shepherds and goat herds in Yemen. They can destroy a country that's very, very poor, but they can't win the war because they can't win the people over. Because what they represent is a form of Islam which is unacceptable to very many Muslims, the Wahhabite view. This is what the Al-Qaeda and ISIS represent. Now, what the Saudis are doing by defeating or by attacking these forces in Yemen is they're turning part of that country over to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Supposedly, we're opposing ISIS and Al-Qaeda. You hear Obama occasionally talk about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and he's using a lot of drone attacks against them. They're growing in their power today because we're supporting the Saudi attacks against their enemies in Yemen. Everywhere you look in the Middle East, the US under Obama and the British in alliance with Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are supporting forces that we're supposedly against. Petraeus, the great hero of Iraq, says we should be allying with Al-Qaeda because they're more moderate than ISIS. Does he remember why he was in Iraq? Why we were in Afghanistan? To defeat Al-Qaeda. We left about 6,000 to 7,000 Americans dead in the sands of those countries to defeat Al-Qaeda. And Petraeus, who's supposedly a strategic genius, is saying we should get rid of Assad and ally with Al-Qaeda against ISIS. Now, that's called lose-lose. It's a bunch of losers imposing a losing strategy, which is an imperial policy, a looting policy. It has something to do with oil, but not just oil. Because the British did this before they had an oil economy. It has to do with something called geopolitics, which is the idea that human beings are animals. And you divide them up by their religions, by their tribes, by the sects within religion. The way you would set up a zoo with monkeys in one cage and lions in the other cage. If you want to get rid of one of them, you let the other one out to eat them. This is the Darwinian jungle of geopolitics. This is the British outlook. This is the viewpoint of Obama. This is the viewpoint of Hillary Clinton and Cruz and Rubio, and probably Trump, although it's hard to tell what he really thinks about these things. But what's their policy? Let these people kill each other so we don't have to. Make it easier to control these lands, control the raw materials, control the sea lanes. And for God's sakes, don't let them develop rail, because they might find out that when they start crossing across each other's borders and trading, maybe they actually like each other. Maybe they have common interests. God forbid we should let that happen. That's what the Project for a New American Century was about. We cannot allow, after the fall of communism, said Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and to the extent George W. Bush could get the words out of his mouth, this is what he was representing. The idea that we cannot allow any nation or block of nations to come together that will get in the way of this new empire. A new empire based on what? Funny money, derivatives, worthless securities. We can't let that be challenged, but it's being challenged now by this Eurasian perspective. Now, the Chinese don't want a war. They're not out for territorial conquest. What they're talking about is win-win. If you win, we win. If we're building railroads with you, if we're developing new resources, if we're making sure that your children get a quality education, that benefits us. See, that used to be the attitude of the American system. That we didn't go out looking for enemies to fight. The enemies we had to fight were ignorance, were poverty, were disease. Things that we didn't know about that were causing problems, like meteors, the potential of an asteroid hitting the Earth and killing large numbers of people. These are the things that we should be working on. How do you do it? You treat each human being, each child, as a potentially creative force, which can make a discover something new, which can increase our mastery over the physical universe, and that will improve the circumstances of everyone in that universe. That's what the win-win that the Chinese are taking up. And that's what the Chinese are doing with their moon mission. And this is why the NASA issue is so important. The Chinese have taken up a challenge of doing a landing on the far side of the moon. Now, some people in Washington think this is a joke. They thought it was a joke until the Chinese put a module on the moon. The Chinese actually are fairly advanced in this right now. But what's the benefit of going to the far side of the moon? Well, you can look out at the universe without the radio and wave interference that's on the other side, where we are. You know, what we see when we look out, we see only a part of the universe. The Chinese believe, and there's good reason to believe this is true, you'll be able to see things more clearly or see other things from the other side of the moon. There's also supposedly more helium-3 there, which is very important in terms of the fusion as an energy source for the future. So the Chinese are doing what visionaries do. You look for those areas of science that we don't know, those aspects of the physical universe that we don't understand. What kind of forces are out there? What's the interaction of forces? What does it mean for us? Instead of this idiotic idea that putting factories in the United States is causing the change in our climate. You know, when climates changed for millions of years without a single factory or an automobile on the planet. How do you explain that? How do you explain ice ages and hot periods thousands of years ago, which we have been able to document? Did they actually have combustion motors and they destroyed their civilization? And if so, where are those artifacts? So we're dealing with a bunch of insanity, which is part of this British empirical attack on creativity. So when you look at what Kennedy was looking at, you look at what Alexander Hamilton was looking at, what Lincoln was looking at, a nation dedicated to the idea of the development of the creativity the creative, productive powers of everyone in our society. That's what the Chinese are trying to do. They've lifted 750 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years. While we've been putting more and more people into poverty in our country. And the Chinese say they still have another 200 to 250 million to go to lift out of poverty. How are they going to do it? They're going to do it by lifting people out of poverty in Malaysia, in Indonesia, working with the Indian government. And let me just finish with this point. The promise of Eurasia is clear, and if people work through this pamphlet, and then we have a pamphlet that we got out last week, that we have here again today, on the US side of this. The enormous potential to solve what are real problems: underemployment, low wages, poverty, not enough housing, not enough hospitals, not enough doctors, not enough scientists. We can deal with that with a major infrastructure push in the United States, linking up with what's going on in China and Russia. But beyond that, there's the whole question of how you get there. And it's not just a question of appealing to people that there's something good that's possible. It's that we've got to defeat an enemy that's evil, that's satanic. Now, what's that enemy doing? They're not just sitting there waiting to see if we're going to succeed. They've been conducting operations against LaRouche and our organization ever since we were formed. When we were 5 people at Columbia University, they were attacking us. But they're also attacking the governments that are involved in this fight, that are refusing to knuckle under to the empire. As I mentioned earlier, that's why they're demonizing Putin and attacking him. That's why we have the forces challenging China over the South China Sea. But there's one other one to look at, which is a clear case: Brazil, which is under enormous attack. What's the issue in Brazil? Well, the B in BRICS is Brazil. The Brazilians concluded that their future depended on major infrastructure projects, that they have a large population, they have a lot of natural resource wealth, but they also have a lot of debt. They also have a lot of poverty. And so, beginning with Lula and now with Dilma Rousseff, who's the present president, they decided they need to link up with Russia and China and India and South Africa. The South Africans are also under attack. But they decided they were going to go with this push for infrastructure. And what happened? Well, there's this scandal, this so-called corruption. What's behind this corruption? When Lula was president, he did not allow ExxonMobil and Chevron and others to bid on the oil that's being discovered there. He set up a company called Petrobras, a state company, like Gazprom in Russia. And what he said is the proceeds from this wealth will go to the people of Brazil. Now, there's an argument that allegations of massive corruption. Now, so far, there's no evidence. They're just the allegations. They're taking a few people who probably were corrupt and saying to them, you're going to go to jail for 100 years unless you make something up against Lula or Dilma. This is what was done in Italy called clean hands, to destroy Berlusconi and destroy the party systems in Italy. That's why Italy is such a basket case. They're trying it in Brazil. Now, you remember when Snowden reported that the US government was wiretapping Dilma Rousseff's phone?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Why were they doing that? Because they wanted to find out where she was going for lunch, who she was meeting with, whether she was getting money from Petrobras. No, they wanted to know what was the status of relationship between Brazil, Russia, and China. They bugged Merkel's cell phone. And Merkel sooner or later is going to have to realize that this is why Germany is being targeted, or that this is an aspect of Germany being targeted. So this attack against Brazil, along with the continued war in Syria, and by the way, I should have said that there's been a big change in Syria. There's a ceasefire that's holding, not because of anything we did, but because of what Putin did. Putin went in there and said, we're not going to let you overthrow this government because this is the only national force that can fight the terrorists. And it's working. The strategy is working. And some of the neighboring Arab governments are paying attention, like Lebanon and Jordan. Even the Saudis are watching this. The Egyptians certainly are. So there's a chance now for this to succeed, this Eurasian perspective to succeed and destroy the empire. And what's the key to it? What happens in the United States. We have a conference on April 7th in New York. And if people can go to that, you'll sign up for it with us and go up there for it. If not, you'll be able to see it, I'm sure, on LaRouche Pack or the Schiller Institute or YouTube or something. But what's the point of the conference? We've launched an initiative that's centered on Keisha's leadership to re-inspire people with this idea of going out into the unknown, exploring the future, making discoveries of nature that can be applied to improving our conditions here. This is the way the United States can link up with China. Sure, we want to fight terrorism together. We do, Obama doesn't. But we, the American people, would like to work with the Russians and the Chinese. We could do that. But it means we've got to get rid of Obama and the whole crowd that controls him. If you don't do it, you're going to end up in war and poverty. And probably a nuclear war where you won't care about poverty because you'll be dead. That's one way to alleviate poverty, kill all the poor people, along with everyone else. So we in this room and in our movement bear a special responsibility to go out and win this fight. And we need resources to do it. And I know some of our supporters are tired of being asked to contribute because you think, well, am I the only one who's contributing? In some cases, you might be right. We don't have a huge number of contributors, and we certainly don't have corporations or think tanks giving to us.
Or super PACs.
Or super PACs, right. We just have some super people. People who want to make sure that this fight succeeds, and whether you can give $58 to get a copy of this pamphlet or $1,000 to help make sure that we keep our offices open. That's part of the responsibility that people have. So I'm going to stop at that and take your questions. And I think the final point I'll just make before we take the questions is that you really have to think about the difference between a nation that's sitting there stupefied by the infantilism of the presidential campaign and a nation which is sitting there excited about the fact that their children are going up to the far side of the moon. In China, there's tremendous optimism. Even people who are still poor, there's national pride, but there's optimism because China's playing a role in developing the world. In our country, what do we have to be proud of? The debate between Rubio and Trump over whose hands are larger? The fact that we ended welfare, which we really didn't end, we just extended welfare to the richest. We need something for Americans to adopt as a mission. And that's why Lyndon LaRouche encouraged the initiative that Keisha took to place NASA back in the front of the minds of the American people. And we've got to go out and fight for that. And if people act stupid at first, they go, well, we can't even afford to fix the potholes in our roads. How can we go to the moon? You say, boy, you have a lot to learn about economics. You sure have a lot to learn from the Chinese. Let me tell you how we're going to fix the potholes. You're not going to do it by pouring asphalt into the potholes. You're going to do it by changing the economy, by changing the people. Our mission is to make the American people better. There's plenty of room for improvement, so it's going to be a long mission. But that's what we're taking. So, Jackie, I saw your hand.
Yeah. Who was the leader before Assad Jr.? Was there a leader in between Junior and Senior?
No.
So he went right after his dad.
Yeah.
Has he done any? I mean, I don't think of ophthalmologists as being terrorists. What has he done that people can point to and say he's a
Well,
bad
I think
guy.
you came, what has he done that they say he's a bad guy?
Yeah, because a lot of people.
When the opposition took up arms, he went out and fought them.
And that's it? He didn't, what about?
Well,
poisoning
here's
his
the
own
argument.
people, or is
Look,
it just
here's the
propaganda?
argument. Assad, the Syrian government supported Hezbollah. So therefore they're terrorists. Now what is Hezbollah?
They're fighting.
Hezbollah is a self-defense organization of Shiites in Lebanon who were attacked repeatedly by Israel. So Iran and Assad supported them. So we said, therefore, Assad is a terrorist. Now, when there were problems between the various sects, Sunni, Shia, as to who has power in Syria, Assad Sr. was actually much more brutal in the way he put it down. In Homs and Hama and a few other places. Assad, the current Assad, Bashar al-Assad, put forward, I think you came in late for this, I mentioned the 5 Cs project he came up with in 2004. That's 5 or 6 years before, 6 years before the Arab Spring. And what did he say? He said, we need a development project that will unify the Arab world, Shia and Sunni, connecting through transportation, energy policy, communications, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Now that was a big project. The IMF opposed it. The World Bank opposed it. And so Syria doesn't have much oil. But what he did do is they have an educated population. There are rights for women in Syria. The Christian community was protected in Syria. So how does that make him a terrorist? He gave support to Hezbollah, which was a self-defense organization. And then what happened is when the Arab Spring started, and the US started promising so-called moderate rebel groups that we would support them in regime change. That's when Assad said, if you come after us, we're going to come after you. Now, was there total freedom of speech and total equality and everything else in Syria? No. It's a tough part of the world. Same thing with Saddam. Same thing with Gaddafi. But was there progress? Yes. Was there progress in the dictatorship of Bahrain, which we support? No. And when their young people rebelled, we went out and gave the government arms to kill them and jail them. In Saudi Arabia, is there freedom of women for women there? No. So there's hypocrisy. This is called geopolitics. Now, the key thing about the Assad regime is that Assad, as in looking for support for these projects, found some support from Russia. And so, and by the way, Syria used to have a special relationship with France, but the French did nothing to help. So the idea that Assad was becoming a puppet for the Russians, well, he was looking for allies. And when the US started arming the so-called rebels, the Civil War broke out. And Assad did what Abraham Lincoln did when the Civil War broke out in the United States. You fight the forces that are trying to overthrow you and separate you. And he did, look, with all that's gone on there, there's still support for Assad and the government. That's why Syria still exists. That's why there's a chance to beat the terrorists. So Putin did what we should have done. He said, you want help with the terrorists, we'll help you. But Putin didn't just do that. He came to the US and said, let's form a coalition to do this. And Obama said, okay, after you get rid of Assad, we'll form a coalition. And the Russians said, if you get rid of Assad, there'll be no forces to fight against the terrorists. So that's Assad's crimes. Now, he's still popular in Syria. He would win an election. What right do the Americans have to say he has to go to form a reconciliation government? Assad is saying to even people who took up arms against him, except ISIS and Al-Qaeda, he's saying, if you put down your arms and you join with us, you'll be given a pardon. You'll be not prosecuted, and you can participate in the government. It's a reconciliation process, somewhat like Nelson Mandela did in South Africa. So this is pure imperial hypocrisy. And when 250, 300, 400,000 people are dead, about half of them are Syrian soldiers. Do you ever hear anybody say, oh, this is a terrible thing because Syria's lost 150,000 soldiers? No. So that's the story in Syria. Betty,
yeah, I was just going to just re-emphasize that. I mean, going back to when Kennedy was in the Senate in the 50s, I mean, he did the unthinkable. He defeated a lodge, for God's sakes, in the election in Massachusetts. He was like the Boston Brahmins, and he was asked. He was fairly young. I think he was like 31 when he went for Senate, and he was asked, how, you know, you're so young, you know, how are you going to, you know, deal with foreign policy, you know, what do you think of the Middle East? And he just took it right from the standpoint of imperialism has dominated these countries in the Middle East, and that and that the United States is associated with these imperial powers, and that's what we have to overcome by offering something much better than simply taking.
And when he was in the Senate, he sided with the Algerians against the French when the crisis was developing there, because he saw what the French had done in Indochina. So
And
Kennedy was a very clear, outspoken opponent of imperial policy.
yeah, and they had that at the Kennedy Memorial in Boston. They have all these speeches.
Yeah, look, it's all there, but here's the problem.
But
Oh, go
I
ahead.
was going to just say, but this is the crux of the matter, is every single country that is involved in BRICS. It's a question of national sovereignty. They want to get rid of Petrobras. They want to privatize the vast wealth and oil and resources of Brazil, so the big oil companies can gobble up and take it over. And they want to do the same thing with everybody else. They want to destroy sovereign nation states and just have an oligarchical rule over the whole world. And the fact that we have a tradition in the United States of standing up against the British Empire, you know, we've got to start that. We've got to lead with that.
It's been forgotten. It's been forgotten. And part of the problem is that we've fallen for this publicity about the Queen really being a nice person who goes around with white gloves. And Prince Charles is really a fun-loving guy. You know, they've created a mythology, but it is a myth. It's similarly, the myth that Obama's a caring person. You know, we're dealing with a lot of myth-making and brainwashing.
Yeah.
But how does it work?
Well, besides the fact that the U.S. news media sucks and nobody can really find out anything that's going on in the world from the U.S. media, you have the culture of the country is not any national mission like we had in the 60s when we had the Apollo projects. And
See, these are things you have to fight for, Betty. And this is where the question comes up.
well, that's what I'm saying is talking to people about what the Chinese are doing and in space and how it's impacting their young people, where all these people have been beamed down a physics lesson from the space station to 60 million Chinese students.
Yeah.
This is something we never had in the United States.
Actually, that's not true. When I was in the 3rd grade, we had a black and white television with bad reception, and we watched the first launching of Alan Shepard in my 3rd grade class. And the principal brought in these little pamphlets about the solar system. And we started studying what are the planets in the solar system, what size they are, where they are, and so on. So we did have that kind of thing. When the Apollo 13 was in trouble, the whole nation was tuned in to watch on the edge of the seats. So we did have that, because that's what a mission does. it inspires in people this sense of wonderment and awe, and at the same time connection to the advance, to the experience. So you're almost experiencing it as a nation with the people who are in the spacecraft. And that's what you lose when you have a destruction of science. Now, the destruction of culture flows from the destruction of a scientific outlook. Because if you can convince people that your mind's not important, then you can convince them it's okay to fill their mind with social media crap and with whatever music makes their body move. You know, and that's where we are. Yeah.
You know, I know of somebody who worked in the process of what do you call it, reevaluating NASA, and he particularly found a lot of irregularities in the way NASA did business with all the big people like Boeing. Any aerospace company that was involved with NASA, and we probably all heard about the $2,000 hammer that they had, or the $5,000 space platters, which is vice versa, stuff like that. And the other thing was that there was never any. One of the things he found, one of the biggest reasons that they kind of didn't like the way they were doing business is that a lot of it was with everybody kind of knew each other, and the new one was something was coming up, and there was the bidding was never, shall we say, publicized in the interest that maybe they could get a better bid, or maybe they could get a better product or something like that. It was always controlled.
Well, let me answer that in the following way. First of all, some of that is an oversimplification, because some of the things that cost more are a result of the numbers of people you have in research and the channels that are involved in it. It's not simply a question of, and I'm not going to defend a $5,000 hammer or something like that, but it's greatly exaggerated. Because the other thing about NASA is for every dollar that was invested by the government, there was between $10 and $14 in return to the overall economy. So that even if there was some redundancy or even some fraud, there could have been processes to eliminate the fraud. But what they did is they used it to attack NASA. And the NASA project as a whole, just like, I'll give you another example. They talk about Medicare as there's fraud in Medicare. And there is some fraud in Medicare. So doctors, hospitals, and others. However, compared to what you get with private insurance, Medicare provides more care, more cost effective than what you get through private insurance. The argument that's used is that these examples that they bring up, and there probably are examples, the idea that some of these companies cut corners or do illegal bidding and things of that sort, that's something that there has to be a process to protect against that. But to throw out a whole program because of it, that's where the problem is. And what was done was to try and build up this idea that the whole of NASA was a boondoggle. And what they were really doing was attacking the effect of NASA on the population. Mm-hmm. And by removing it, by saying, look, it's just like everything else, it's corrupt, it's no good, you take away the inspiration and the enthusiasm that actually was there.
Well, I was going to say, this certain person that I know of was kind of like having a conversation over dinner because he didn't have nobody that he could think of that he could talk to. And one of the things he mentioned was that it's a damn shame that a lot of these things couldn't just be overcome by, shall we say, somebody bringing somebody in and saying, hey, listen, we got 5,000 hammers here, man, and $5,000 a hammer. No, you know that's not right. What are we going to do about it?
You see, that's what I'm saying.
No, hang on.
Go ahead.
Okay, hang on. Hey, bottom line is the guy said, I don't think it's right what they're trying to do. because my job is to find out these things, you know, and he would find them, okay, in invoices and stuff like that. And he would start questioning, hey, well, if this thing was bought, why wasn't this company or this company involved? See, and the thing kept coming back to the same thing. Hey, you know, somebody knows somebody, and that was never asked. No, but hang on. My point is,
it's not true.
well, hey, I don't know that.
No, I'll tell you, because there were extensive investigations. There were police agencies that were looking into these things. There were congressional investigations. And what they found is there were very few irregularities compared to the total amount that was spent. And they did address those irregularities. The problem is that what was done was these things were used to be blown up out of proportion to shut down a program. And you know, this is where your friend may be very honest and sincere in what he's trying to do. But what I'm saying is they did address it. And that's the, you have to do that in government. That's why you have regulations. The people who use that to shut down NASA are the ones who try and get rid of regulations. Now, here's the example. Talk about billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in fraud in banking. Was any of that addressed?
No.
So you can, for every $5,000 hammer you can show me, I'll show you $2 billion of mortgage-backed security fraud, which put hundreds or thousands of people out of their homes.
Were a lot of people in jail too?
No, people weren't put in jail.
No,
but little people.
Little
Yeah.
people, the guys that were over there trying to convince somebody, you know, you want to refinance this mortgage, and we're going to give you the equity that you got in your house.
People didn't go to jail who ran it at the top.
Right.
So the point I'm making is, you want to talk about a scale of fraud. We have the biggest fraud in the world in our banking system right now.
We do.
And the biggest fraud in the world in our insurance and Obamacare. And no one addresses it. So that's what I'm saying, that this was a targeted operation to go after the program as a whole.
Right.
And that's, your friend was right in saying it was a shame that it got to that point. But
please, you know what? I stand with you.
I know.
I think that, you know what, it's a damn shame that they closed that, because, you know, I personally got to meet several astronauts, not from the United States, but I sold several cars to, I was a car salesman back then, but I sold several cars to astronauts from France, one from England. They came by after, they kind of talked to each other, this guy will treat you right. I did everything I could to make this things happen for them, because they needed somebody to show them how to do it, how to secure transportation, which I was glad to do, because, you know, it was beneficial towards me. But my point is, you know, I think it also, this whole thing that you're speaking about, the empire, that, you know, one of the things that is apparently, you know, that, you know, we are kind of stuck in the idea that we could take over Syria, because, you know, that would lead us a clear path. You know, I mean, Libya and all those, you know, hey, they were easy. You know, the CIA was in there handling down guns and all that, but they don't want to say that. You know what I'm saying?
well, but we're going to say it, because what we're saying is that the real fraud, this is the real fraud, because it goes against our Constitution and against the principle of progress. And we have to fight it. And I think that's the important point.
That's true.
Yeah.
Amen.
Harley, would you develop, as briefly as possible, arguing with people who say, well, you know, Obamacare, it's not perfect, it's great, but you know, I didn't have health insurance before. But I want to give a concrete example. We had to pay taxes when we went to H&R Block to pay our taxes. We found out that I wasn't covered by health insurance. We thought we were, and my daughter. We had to pay over $1,000, which of course other people.
That's the so-called mandate.
Right.
Yeah.
So we had to pay taxes for not having health insurance. My husband had it. It was a big mistake from his human resources company. So we had to pay taxes over $1,000, like $1,200.
Because it was probably cheaper than what you would have paid for the insurance.
Yeah, okay, so therefore, now people, and I talked to an insurance agent, he said, I had some, and these are middle-class people, not poor people, who get some subsidized insurance. They decided, no, they're gonna pay the taxes on not having health insurance because they cannot afford the $900 a month for Obamacare for a family plan. So anyway, it's important to be able to develop for people the concept that it is a fraud. And for these people to say, yeah, but you know, some people didn't have it before. They didn't have insurance.
Well, look, this is how you manipulate people. You say, we're going to give you something. The government's going to pay part of your cost. And people don't read this small print. The deductibles on these things can be $5,000, $6,000, $8,000.
Yep.
Which means you pay the first $5,000, $6,000. If you have to pay that, then if you didn't have enough money to buy an insurance policy, you needed a subsidy, how are you going to cover the deductible? How are you going to cover the additional out-of-pocket? This was basically the government giving money to insurance companies, with the fraud being that this will give you coverage.
And that you get taxed if you don't have to do it. You have
Yeah,
to do it.
you
It's
have
the law.
to do it. Now, that's why it was a fraud from the beginning. But secondly, it's a gift to the pharmaceutical industry because of what Bush did with the Medicare on the so-called donut hole and these other things. What they're doing is they're giving money to the insurance companies, the big pharma, the HMOs, and the cover story is you get coverage. Now, if you really want people to be covered, you have universal coverage, which is Medicare for all or single payer, whatever you want to call it. But the best approach would be Medicare for all. They do this in Europe. Now, what do you hear from the right wing in this country? Oh, well, that's socialism and you get bad care. I assure you,
it's horrible.
I assure you, you get much better care in France or Germany or Austria than you do in the United States under Obamacare. Now, the other part, the more serious part, is they're using this to cut back overall health care. Rural health care hardly exists anymore. The number of trauma centers are being cut back. The number of hospitals are being cut back in the name of efficiency. You look at the VA system, it's a catastrophe. So, when someone says, well, it's better than nothing, you say, why do you settle for something that's no good? Because it's better than if you just let people die in the street. Well, you know what? People are dying in the street from this. And we've got to say to people that this is grasping at straws. They're trying to say something good about Obama. The guy's a killer. This is part of a killer plan. And at the higher end of age, what they are doing is what Sarah Palin, it's too bad she was the one who gave it this term, but death panels, before she said that, we called it the Nazi T4 policy. This is why we put a mustache on Obama, a Hitler mustache on Obama, because the policy that he adopted defines certain categories of people as useless eaters, people who we can no longer afford to take care of. And we've been moving into that direction. And as we have an aging population in this country, more and more people are going to be told, well, just check this here, your end-of-life care, so that we know that we briefed you on this and you know what your options are. What are your options? You get sick, you die. We're not going to pay for it. Now, some private health insurance is better, but you pay an arm and a leg for that. And companies are being forced to get rid of health insurance. So this whole thing was a fraud, and it was a Hitler killer policy. And someone who argues it's better than nothing is someone who's a scared victim and thinks maybe they're getting something. And if they actually try to use it, they're going to see how bad it really is.
Yeah, I was at this town hall meeting Thursday, right in Victoria, Texas, Lake Transhold, and there were more people than usual. It was like a little bit upwards of 100 people, I would think. This was at the Emerging Technology Center, and most of the meeting was occupied with questions about the Veterans Administration. And I think, that it may be coming to a point just about now where people are starting to look around and see the social cost of all of these little wars.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, I think they figured after World War II that, World War II has done a pretty good job of shutting down the Depression. Right. So figured maybe we should just make war into an industry, right, and just let that be what we do, right. And you don't want to get into any other large wars. If you lose one of them, then you'd really be
said war is a racket.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm saying it's like it's the principal industry right now. The only country I can think of for which warship, continuous warfare should have ever been a principal industry would have been the Mongol Empire, right? I mean, that's about, might have made sense, for them. I don't see that it makes
Well, the
sense
Roman
for us.
Empire had a lot of wars. The British Empire had lots and lots of wars. They were colonial wars.
Where's the Mongols?
But here's,
today?
Ted, the thing, it's just a little dangerous to, I'm not saying you're doing it, but to reduce the argument for war that it helps the war manufacturers. There's actually an intent behind these wars, which is not just to enrich the arms dealers and others. And this is the broader sense that Eisenhower was talking about, the military-industrial complex. There are forces, institutions, that exist for the sake of destroying nations for geopolitical purposes. And this is to attack cultures and people. It's population reduction. It's destruction of potential opponents to your hegemonic system. And at the end of the Cold War, there was this theory put forward by Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, who said, look, with the collapse of communism, all the isms have been discredited except free market capitalism. And therefore, our system is the best, and it's the end of history because there are no longer going to be struggles. Now, what's been the result of this?
It's even worse.
Permanent warfare. And it's worse, you're right. Why? Because we're imposing a system of free trade on peoples and nations that don't benefit from free trade. It's the corporate cartels that benefit from the free trade. And the people be damned. And this is where then you see, well, sure, arms dealers, there's a whole group of contractors, consultants, who make a fortune pushing these lines about why we have to have opposition to the Russians moving into Crimea. And they have conferences that are well funded by various kinds of think tanks and billionaires. And you boil it all down and you're dealing with an empire. That's what it is. Yeah, Pete.
I'd like you, if you can, to elaborate a little bit more on the our strategic intent, because had O'Malley stayed in the race, we'd probably have something to work with in the election. But right now, there's nothing. And the idea of getting the population to think about NASA is great. How do you do that en masse? And what kind of a strategic sort of direction? I know what Keisha's doing is a critical part of that. But moving large forces is not easy.
Well, that's the strategic intervention, because we don't have a candidate. We don't have open institutions, but we have a lot of people in institutions who are now open to what we're saying. We're beginning to see, we're just at the very beginning, to see what's going on within the broader NASA community. And Keisha and Ian and Brian and a few others have had a chance to meet people who are involved in that. And they all know someone, and they know groups, and they're part of organizations. I mean, just something like the NASA Rotary Club, NASA Area Rotary Club. There are lots of people that belong to these groups where you have to encourage and inspire and kick people to come out and say, look, this is what we've got to do. And so it does become strategic in that sense. At the same time, we're talking to people in business and finance who recognize that quantitative easing is a fraud, that the Federal Reserve System is no damn good, you have to take it down, that it's just a front for the Wall Street banks. And when Lynn says you've got to destroy Wall Street, let me just point something out to you. Lynn's been saying this now for a number of years, going back minimally to 2007, but before that, he's been always opposed to these speculative swindles. I used to do lots of presentations when, back in 98, 99 on the dot-com bubble. In the 80s, we were going after Milken and the junk bond bubble. So we've been after this for a long time.
Deregulation of banks?
Yeah. Yeah, in 80 and 82, there were 2 deregulation bills that we attacked on banking, which opened the door to the S&L crisis. So we've been at this for a long time. Now, at each phase, there are people who, we had a Henry Gonzalez, for example. When he was the chairman of the banking committee, he took this on. Now we have fewer and fewer people who have the guts to say something. Almost no one in Congress. But we have to have our voice resonate outside of the presidential campaign, because the presidential campaign is a bunch of crap. There's nothing there. But people know it. People are really angry about the idea that you have to accept a flawed candidate at best, or a lesser evil. Now, that's where our insistence on this higher question begins to gain some momentum. Now, if it were just doing that in the United States, trying to find the ones and twos in institutions and moving them, there'd be no chance. But we have governments. We have this whole Eurasian perspective, that I was going through. There are governments that are supporting this. If U.S. businessmen wanted to, they could be involved in some of these projects. But to do that, they're going to have to go against their government. They're going to have to go against the free trade, the exclusionary free trade agreements. So we are going to be talking to people who are part of these institutions. We are talking. We're trying to bring them into the New York conference. We're having regional conferences when we can. And on a day-to-day basis, we've just got to talk to more people. Now, how do you get it to become a mass situation? You get people who are influential, who suddenly say, look, we got to change our policy. Just give you an example. It's not yet a tipping point. But what does it mean when the New York Times exposes Hillary Clinton as a fraud on Libya? That everything she says about smart power in Libya was a fraud. That actually we destroyed a country and opened the door for terrorism. And it ended up killing our people and killing a lot of Libyans. That's an example of this thing opening up. Michael Flynn, the former head of the DIA, exposing not just Obama's support for terrorism, but saying that he was writing memos in the summer of 2012, warning that we were facilitating the development of the Islamic State. And that was ignored up to and including after the Benghazi attacks. He's going around the world talking about this. So we need 10, 15, 20 more generals doing that. We need a few more people like Tulsi Gabbard exposing the fraud of the regime change in Syria. So that's the only way you can do it. If we had a good presidential candidate, it'd be easier. We don't. But we do have Keisha, who's tested by her past experience leading this NASA initiative. And there are people responding to that, including internationally. I can tell you I do things as LaRouche's spokesman on radio, on internet blogs that are starting to get bigger and bigger audiences. And that we're now getting emails from around the world of people responding to it. So you keep doing these things. We run into people like Joe ran into someone from a Swedish newspaper. Where was that? That was during the election. So, we just have to look for every opening. The key to it is we've got to maintain our persistence and our optimism in the face of stupidity, pessimism, despair, and people who have given up. And find the ones who won't give up, who want to fight. The fact that we have this representative from the Egyptian government will be speaking at our meeting on Saturday, next Saturday. There are people who look to us as a way to reach the American people. And we've got to bring the United States on the side of Eurasia. Now, I'll tell you the last thing LaRouche said about it. Don't try and do it on the cheap. Don't try and come up with a slogan that might be popular, like join China and maybe you'll get a full-time job. Or support NASA and maybe we'll come up with a cure for Zika. You've got to focus on this higher order so that when people get into the fight, they're not going to be deterred by some running into a practical wall. They're going to be able to jump over the wall. Yeah.
Well, that was basically what I was thinking of, including to the discussion with Pete beat me to it. I was just thinking about some of these problems that I run into in organizing people that I talk to, which is the tendency to settle for the lesser evil. Yeah, we put out this video, "Don't be a chump for Trump," and some of the people, one person actually responded to it saying, "Well, you know, Hillary is like cancer, and Trump is just like herpes. And once you settle for herpes instead of cancer, please." And you know, I mean,
Yeah, they say it.
you think about people like that, and you're just, you know, you smack your forehead, and you're like, why? But I think where it really comes from is this problem of there's no hope in a person, and when they don't have a hope for the future, they say, well, how can I negotiate with the terms of the present to try to find something which will kill me more slowly or less, knowing that it will still kill them. And they're sick about that, and they're angry about that, but they'll put up with it. And I think that one of the things that's so critical about this space program initiative, even though it doesn't have a candidate attached to it for president, which we need a candidate for president who's going to be a representative of the soul of the nation, is that it has the tendency to actually cause people to have hope for the future again. And once they have hope for the future, they don't want to settle for herpes over cancer. They don't want to settle for any one of these losers. They will actually start to demand real competence.
But this gets to LaRouche's overriding theme, which is that we've got to change the way people think.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now people have adapted themselves to losing. They've adapted themselves to the fact that you can't have a positive outcome. You can only have a less worse outcome. And once you adapt yourself to that, then you're not capable of fighting to improve it, and you're not even going to get a less worse outcome. I mean, this is the problem of lowering expectations. You lower expectations to the point where you're willing to settle for something bad. And had mankind done that throughout history, we wouldn't have a human race. And it's always the people who don't settle that shape the future. And unfortunately, there are very few people who have the internal fortitude and confidence, the willingness to sacrifice everything if necessary to sustain that vision. You know, you think about people who have been killed. You think about what happened to St. Peter. Think about, we're coming up on Easter. Think about the life of Jesus. You know, the idea that you fight for something even though you know that your ultimate outcome, no matter what, whether you win or lose a fight, you're ultimately going to die. So what's the fight for? Is it for some personal gratification? Well, unless you get gratification from the idea that you're improving the future, whatever gratification you have is not worth it, because it involves a compromise. And so you fight for the future, and that's the key point that you're making. You fight for the future and make that your mission in life. And as Lynn said, one of the first times I ever met Lynn, which was now 40, almost 44 years ago, he talked about this idea of when you leave this life, if you did something for the future to make the future better, you can leave this world with a smile on your lips. If you base your sense of identity in life on collecting experiences and goods and money and things of that sort, you're sad when you die because you can't take it with you. You have nothing that goes with you. And this is where you get to the question of, when Mendelssohn's talk of Plato, his datum, the soul. What is the soul? What is it that is characteristic in human existence that outlasts our mortal existence? That's what we have to worry about. And you see these phony Christians like Ted Cruz, who talk about saving the soul when he talks about bombing the desert until it turns into molten glass.
Yes.
There's a person who's got a black soul. So, I think this is really, and it does get to your question, Pete, that you fight to get an audience. And then when you get an audience, you fight with individuals in that audience to take up a higher mission, as opposed to trying to convince them to support this bill or that bill or this technology. Because if they get that sense of a higher purpose, then it's pretty easy to show them how we can improve the situation. But if you don't get them to that willingness to fight for a higher purpose, they're not even going to put themselves out to fight for a good policy. We see that, look, there's 70 sponsors on a Glass-Steagall bill in the House. None of them will go to the floor of the House and fight for it. Because they haven't decided that killing Wall Street is the only way you're going to survive as a nation. If they understood that, and that the reason we want to do that to Wall Street is to free the real creative potential of the society, then they would be up there waging the fight.
Oh, on the space program.
Yeah.
The Saturn V had 1 billion parts, and it never had a failure. So the fact that we actually succeeded 10 years in getting to the moon is proof that the contractors were its features.
Yeah, whatever, that's the point. Whatever problems there were, we had a successful program. And they had to troubleshoot all along the way. That's it, if you see the movie Apollo 13, from what I can tell, it's relatively accurate, that when they ran into a problem in space, you had these guys scrambling to try and figure out, what do we do? How do we fix it?
Yeah, they had problem-solving teams ready to go.
Yeah, you had to do that. Now, these things are somewhat costly. You have to have redundancy. When you're doing state-of-the-art, innovative programs, you don't always know what's the pathway that will work. This is the problem we've had with fusion. Because of budget restrictions and constrictions, we don't have the ability to do a broad-based scientific approach with 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 prototypes. You're reduced to putting all the effort into one prototype. And so by going on the cheap, you actually extend the time it takes to make the breakthrough. Now, a sane society says, if this is what we need, if we need a virtually unlimited cheap source of fuel that has implications for the whole economy as fusion does, let's not be stupid and restrict the spending of it. Let's put what we need in there, which means we need more scientists. We need more research centers. We need more cooperation worldwide. That takes some money. But that's the kind of thing that increases the total productive wealth by the discoveries that are made and then the implementation of the new technology. So, as Lynn is pointing out, any effort to do it another way is just plain stupid. And yet we're forced into that. Let me just finish with a couple of points. April 7th, if you can make it, see us and register with us. Or if one of the things you can do if you're willing to make a contribution, if you understand these things and want to make sure that we succeed, we need resources to build this conference. We need a certain amount to pay for the conference. There's some transportation costs, but beyond that, we have to make sure that we're in a position where we have an ability to get our voice out there. And that means gasoline, that means printing, that means running computer systems. These things, look, we're doing it on the cheap. We don't pay our people for the most part. The old joke about we're a nonprofit corporation. We didn't start out that way, but that's what we are. Well, we don't recruit people by saying, join our movement and give up all your worldly goods. But your joy in the movement is in fighting for the ideas. But we've got to make sure we keep our organization moving. And people can help, whether it's $5 or $1,000 or $5,000. Any bit makes a difference. Yeah.
Is there any discussion about going back onto college campuses and getting people?
Well, I mean, look, we have a lot of discussion about a lot of things. We have a small organization. People should join us. We'll try and do some things on campuses. One of the things that's obvious is UH Clear Lake. You're near NASA. You got people there. You got a university here, Rice University, that has an astrophysics program where they don't let you on campus. So it's a little hard to do organizing there. But Rice students
private campus,
get off the campus sometimes, so you can find them around. So we just got to do a lot of organizing.
Whole university you can't go on the campus?
Well, it's a private school and they have laws
You can
against
go
setting
on,
up
but
table.
you can't
Oh.
set up.
I see, yeah, so it's,
Oh,
No, and I was in the library of Rice last week, right in the lobby there. They have a big display called the Rice Stuff, right? The Rice Stuff, with 3 glass cases, of the whole thing, their pride, of how many Rice students were involved in Apollo and Kennedy's speech, how Kennedy met with, somehow.
yeah, we do have to call in there because there are some people who are still involved in that.
Right.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we have a very unique opportunity with the space program here. I mean, because one thing that's very particular is that we're in the South. And so this has always been a fight in terms of the progress of a nation, that if you can actually turn the backwardness of the population, the collapse of economy, the downtroddenness of particularly Southern culture into something great. And I mean, we had examples of that with the TVA with Franklin Roosevelt, completely transforming the area, the rural electrification, all of this. And then you had the space program. Yeah, then you had the space program. And I've been reading about, I mean, obviously it was a fight, but the key thing about it is that you were able to take an area that totally transformed not just the South, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, but actually transformed the entire nation. And right now, what we're emphasizing around the revival of the space program is that this is not just a localized project. This is a national driver for the economy. And the best source that we have right now to reviving the physical economy is through the space program. And that's what's so unique about LaRouche's method in terms of his decades-long understanding of physical economy and economic forecast, because he's taking this from the standpoint of how do you increase the productive powers of labor per area, per square kilometer of all your society. So all the questions that came up, I was just sitting here thinking before about, the healthcare and so forth. If you had a society that was focused around, we have to advance the creative powers of every single human being. It's starting with the youngest of our nation, that you have to make the minds of the most vulnerable young people to be greater than the minds of those that come after, that were before their parents and grandparents, and you're creating geniuses, then you're not going to have a healthcare system that kills people, because you're trying to keep people alive so they can be productive citizens. And that's the best source we have right now is through the space program. And so people are looking at it from that standpoint and not just, that's nice if you're into rocketry and you're an aerospace engineer or something like that. But all of us people who have to do, normal people stuff, we don't, it's cool to look at rockets fly up in the sky back in the 60s. But, no, that's what was the driver for our economy. And everybody had, there was a fight to bring everybody into that process.
Well, and I think the other point of this presentation today, what we're doing as a movement, is that this fits with a global fight that's already in motion. We're not saying, wouldn't it be great if somebody picked up on these ideas? The Chinese are doing it.
Right.
With limitations, the Russians are doing it. The Indians are doing it. They're looking to us. Is there a voice in the United States that will join? And that's why you can't accept, even if someone says something right on one issue in the presidential campaign and say, see, that's better than the others. It's not the voice that's needed. The voice that's needed is, we're all in on the Eurasian perspective. This is the American ideal. This is what we want for our future. And that's what we have to fight for. Yeah.
That's a dumb question. It's like, right now we have giant ships carrying merchandise from China over to the American continents and then just heading back empty. have you given any thought to how you would go about making sure that this global railroad that you're talking about doesn't simply become a more powerful vehicle for that sort of business?
Well, you have to build up the United States economy again.
Where we produce things the same.
Yeah.
You also have to have more reasonable trade deals with other countries.
Of course you do. I mean, look, we've got to scrap every single free trade agreement. We've got to get back to an idea of bilateral, multilateral talks, but which start from this idea of the win-win strategy, as opposed to how do we enable corporations to make the biggest profits, pay the lowest wages and charge the highest prices.
Right. One thing I tell people about one world government, you know, the people that want to impose one world government over the world, is that nations are nature's way of weeding out bad political ideas. In other words, you know, the reason, to my thinking, that the Soviet Union collapsed was that the people that ran it, you know, the people had no possibility of rising up and overthrowing that regime. It was like the government had a complete monopoly of weapons, right? It's like the people that ran this communist system were able to get into these shopping malls in Sweden and Germany, and they were able to see ordinary middle-class European people buying things which they couldn't own. I think that was the most major factor. Now, if you had one world government, then that couldn't happen. You understand what I'm saying? First time, you know, in other words, if somebody in France starts doing something badly or comes up with a really bad idea, then, you know, 15 years down the road, the people, you know, the French are going to see the people in the other countries suffering all their suffering.
Look, that's a logical point, but it's actually more simple than that. The people who run this empire want to make sure that no country has an opportunity for their citizens to improve. That's the way the empire works. And so, you know, what you're describing is an aspect of that. But it is, if you dumb people down to the point where they think the best I can expect is a little bit of comfort, a little relaxation, maybe one good meal a week, and that's all I can accept, all I can expect rather, then you've won the fight if you're the empire. So the problem is we're dealing with an imperial policy. So thank you and see you next week. And remember, next week we'll have the vice consul from Egypt speaking.